Well, this is Sunday morning, and in 2 more weeks we have Easter. And Easter, of course, you guys all know what that is. And this is the time when Christ gave his life. This is the time when God gave his only begotten Son. And what I wanted to do this morning was I wanted to kind of pull back and give a 10,000-foot view of what's going on at the time of the crucifixion of Christ. What are the last days of Christ like? If you're reading the scripture, generally speaking, you get bits and pieces, and a lot of times in today's world right now, if you were to turn on Christian TV, you'd hear a lot of sermons that are some really powerful sermons. Most of the time, a minister is going to pick a passage or an event in the last week of Christ's life and focus on that. And I think it's important for you and I to be able to put that in perspective. What's the whole picture? What's really going on? Now, for a chronology, a basic overview chronology of what's going on, you can go into the REV commentary in John chapter 18, verse 13. And I was thinking this morning, I really need to make this into an appendix because it's can be hard for somebody, and I used to do this myself. I know I put a chronology somewhere. Where did I put it? And so then I'd have a hard time finding it. So I need to make this, and I need to expand it a little bit and make it into an appendix. But if you're looking, then I'd recommend John 18:13 is where the chronology is. And I'd also say that especially when you read these events of Christ's life, it's really neat to have a notebook so you can jot things down, because there's so much going on, and there's so many lessons coming at you so fast. And I'm going to try to point out some of those lessons today. But in any case, so what we're going to do is I'm just going to, like I say, give the 10,000-foot view. And so we start, and so we'll just start out. It was Monday during the day that of the last week of Christ's life, Monday during the day that there started the Last Supper. And the Last Supper continued until after dark. And this can be confusing a little bit in Bible chronology, because at sunset in the Jewish world, it started a new day. But the world in the Roman world, the new day didn't start till midnight. So what I did in the chronology in John 18 was I put Roman time, Jewish time, so you can see them both. So Monday, Jewish time and Roman time, you start the Last Supper. As sundown comes and goes, the next day starts, Tuesday starts in Jewish time. And it's that Tuesday, you and I would call it Monday night, that Christ goes to the Garden of Gethsemane, and then he is arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he's taken first to Annas, and then he's taken to Caiaphas, and then from there he's taken back to the temple in the morning. In fact, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to share my screen and bring up a picture so that we can do this a little better. Let's see. Can you all see the picture? Whoops, nope, we can't. There you go. So can you see that picture on your screen?
No.
Not yet.
Not yet.
No, you can't. Okay. Why not? Let me do it again. Maybe what I need to do is this way.
There.
I'll bring that up, and then I'll start to share my screen. Share, and share. Okay. So you should be able to see that at this point. Can you guys see that?
Yes.
Okay, good. So what you've got, this is the Mount of Olives. We're starting over here at the west, and we're looking east across Jerusalem. And so Jesus Christ, we have no idea where he had the Last Supper. I know if you go to Israel, they say, oh, this is the house where he had the Last Supper. You have to understand that the traditional mindset has been, if we have a place for these things, then people can anchor their faith. And I don't believe in anchoring your faith in a make-believe thing just so you have something there physically. So we don't really know where in Jerusalem Christ, where he had the Last Supper. But after, and the Last Supper, by the way, it shows us the importance of the Last Supper because it starts in John chapter 13 and goes all the way through the prayer in John 17. So that's 5 chapters. And in John's only 21 chapters. The entire book of John's only 21 chapters. So it tells you that 25% of the book of John is on that Last Supper. And that shows you how important in the history of Jesus as the Son of God, the Last Supper is. In the other Gospels, it doesn't take up much time at all. You know, maybe 10 or 12 verses or something like that. So Jesus has the Last Supper in here. And then he goes to the Garden of Gethsemane. This is the Mount of Olives back here. And so he goes to the Garden of Gethsemane, which we believe would have been on the lower slopes of the of the Mount of Olives. And it was from here that he was arrested. And so then he was taken to here, which is the compound of Annas and Caiaphas. And Annas and Caiaphas lived in the same high priestly compound. And that's very important to know. We'll come upon that more later. So and they probably would not have brought him through the city because they didn't, want to cause they had Roman army with them. They had temple police with them. Of course, they had Jesus himself. So my gut feeling is they brought him all the way around the outside of the city and then brought him into Annas and Caiaphas's house. And that's where he had a fake trial at night. Then in the morning, very, very early, they would have taken him to the temple, and he had a daybreak trial in the temple. And then after that, they took him to Pilate. There's been a huge controversy over where Pontius Pilate was, and I believe that there are some progressive scholars that have done a very good job in showing, and I'll do more detail on this, but showing that Pilate's administrative center, because he had a place where he would stay and he had an administrative center. And Pilate's administrative center was the old Hasmonean palace, which is right here. And this becomes very important in the development of the Gospels and understanding some of what the Gospels say. So here's Christ now. He's with Pilate at the old administrative center. He's tried at daybreak, and the Roman government started their business very early in the morning because they usually stopped by noon or at the latest by 2. So a Roman day typically went from 6 in the morning until noon, 6 in the morning until 2, and then it was over. So it was fine to bring Christ to Pilate early in the morning. Pilate knew it was a hot potato, didn't want to deal with it, and sent Christ up here to the western palace where Herod Antipas was staying, and he had come down from the Galilee for the feast of the Passover. Jesus would not talk to Herod, so Herod sent him back to Pilate. Pilate continued the trial, sent Jesus off to be beaten and tortured. That could have been here in this palace, was probably more likely over here in the Antonia, and then where most of the Roman troops would stay. And then at 9 in the morning, Jesus Christ would have been marched out. And I have what I think anyway, we'll see, is very good evidence that Jesus Christ was crucified on the Mount of Olives. Then he would have been buried very close to that, down here somewhere on the lower slopes of the Mount of Olives. And that's where he got up from the dead. That's where he met Mary Magdalene. And then when he said, I've got to go up to my Father on Sunday morning, he did not mean ascend, because he wasn't going to ascend for 40 more days. But what he meant was he had to go up the hill to the temple and present himself as the first fruits of the harvest. He was the first one risen from the dead. So there's kind of your picture of the last days of Jesus Christ. So let's now go with that. Let's go to Monday, and we're in John chapter 18. And so let's see. Yeah, okay. So in John, and if you notice, actually, if we start in John chapter 17, Jesus is still at the Last Supper, and he finishes Verse 26, I made known to them your name and will make it known so the love with which you loved me can be in them and I in them. And then verse 8, chapter 18, when Jesus had spoken these words, he went out with his disciples across the ravine of the brook Kidron to where there was a garden, which he himself and his disciples entered. So you've got Jesus and he's in the city of Jerusalem like we saw. And then he goes out of the city and he goes across the ravine of the brook Kidron, which is a dry ravine most of the year and then runs with water during the rainy season. And then he and his disciples entered the Garden of Gethsemane. And then verse 2, now Judas, who was betraying him, also knew the place, for Jesus often met there with his disciples. Judas then, having received the Roman cohort, and it's pretty important that we understand there's some controversy and a lot of times some confusion about whether it was Roman soldiers or Jewish police that arrested Jesus. And yes, the Jews did have a police force. They didn't have a nationwide police force. What they had was a temple police force made of priests and Levites that were allowed to go in the temple. But remember, they didn't want Gentiles going into the temple proper, and they wanted to keep order in the temple. They wanted to keep it holy for God and that kind of thing. And so the Jews had organized a police force that oversaw the temple and the things of the temple. And of course, the high priest was the top dog over that police force. And so if you remember when Jesus Christ was teaching one time, the leaders and the high priest sent people to arrest Jesus. That's the police force. And then Jesus was talking so boldly and powerfully, they came back to the high priest and said, nobody's talked like this. We didn't arrest him. So that's what that's talking about. So it's important that we have the picture that when this group came to arrest Jesus Christ, it wasn't some little dinky group of, like 15 police from the temple. This was a well-armed, large force, including Roman troops and temple police. And they came because they expected they might get some resistance, as we find out they did, but not in the way you'd think. So here comes the Roman cohort and the temple police from the chief priests and the Pharisees, went there with lanterns and torches and weapons. Verse 4, so Jesus, knowing everything that was about to happen to him, partly from the word of God and partly by revelation, went out and says to them, who are you looking for? They answered, Jesus of Nazareth. He said to them, I am he. And Judas also, who was betraying him, was standing with them. Now we might want to say, well, why didn't Judas just say he's in the Garden of Gethsemane? Why did Judas have to betray Jesus Christ? And you have to remember, number one, it's dark and things weren't well lighted. Number two, it's Passover. There were tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of people in Jerusalem at the time. So literally almost every square foot of ground was being taken up by some human body. Basically in that culture at that time period, the Jews of the area, the native Jews, they had brown eyes, they had black hair, and they wore similar clothing. So it was real easy to disappear in a crowd, and you want to make sure that you get the right guy. So they took Judas with them, and that's why he was there. And when he said, I am he, they fell backward and fell to the ground, and that shows the boldness of Jesus Christ and indicates the judgment of God in the situation. And then notice verse 8, and I think what was prophecy about, there was a prophecy about flourishing in times of drought. And here's Jesus Christ. He's about to be arrested. He knows, he's read Isaiah 53. He's read Psalm 22. He's read the servant songs in Isaiah. He knows he's going to be beaten up. He knows he's going to be whipped. He knows he's going to be killed. And is he what? And Ricky Zidane prophecy: "Be anxious for nothing." Is he anxious? No. What's he concerned about? What's he concerned about? He says, verse 8, "I told you that I am he. So if you're looking for me, let these men go." That's astounding. You know, that at this time, he is so focused on what's going on. He's so prepared himself mentally. He says, let these people go. You know, and whenever I read the scripture, I'm looking for many lessons, you know, little tiny lessons that are buried in the text. And here's a great one. In times of great pressure, we can still think of the other guy. Absolutely. And then Peter, of course, Mr. Impetuous Peter, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. And we learned from the Gospel of Luke that Jesus Christ healed his ear. Now, why? I mean, Judas is facing a very large, well-trained, well-armed fighting force. Peter is facing that. I'm sorry. Peter's facing that, and he's got one sword. Why would he attack? What's going on in his mind? And what's going on in his mind is, does he know Jesus Christ is the Messiah? Yes. Does he know Jesus is going to die? No, they still, I mean, here they are. It's after the Last Supper. They're in the Garden of Gethsemane. Here comes the force to arrest Jesus Christ. They don't even know he's going to die yet or be crucified. And when he was, it caught them completely off guard. People of Emmaus are going back to Emmaus. Peter and the apostles are hiding behind closed doors. What just happened? See, they still thought the Messiah was going to start a war and win and conquer, just like Isaiah 63 says. And so, you know, Peter's like, I guess I got to get this thing started myself. He didn't know what was going on. And so he grabs his sword and he attacks Malchus, the servant of the high priest, who must have been close to him. Of course, Jesus then stops that and says, you know, don't, no more of this, you know. And so Pete, and then when Peter and the apostle, I'm sure they were confused. Like I say, they didn't know that Christ was even going to die. And here he's being arrested, and he heals the high priest and tells Peter to put away his sword and no more of this. And what's going on? Then he says, look at verse 11. Then Jesus said to Peter, put the sword into its sheath. Am I not to drink the cup that the Father has given to me? And of course, then another gospel says that all the disciples at that point fled. They just were confused. They didn't know what was going on, and they all ran off. And so in verse 12, then the Roman cohort and the commander of the temple of the police of the Jews seized Jesus, bound him. And verse 13, they led him to Annas first, for he was father-in-law to Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. And what had happened was, one of the reasons they would take him to Annas first is that in the law of Moses, you were the high priest until you died. Now the Romans didn't like working with Annas, and so they replaced him with Caiaphas, who was younger, more energetic, maybe a little more impetuous, and easier to work with from a Roman perspective. So the Romans came in and replaced Annas the high priest. But from the perspective of the Jews, Annas would always be the high priest. So they would take him to Annas first. He's the power behind the throne, if you will. Now I want to go back and share my screen again, because there's a couple important points. I'll bring up this map of Jerusalem again. There's a couple important points that we need to get when we look at this compound, this high priestly compound here. I believe that we absolutely know where this is. There are some things in the work of Christ, like the place of the Last Supper, that we don't know where it occurred. I think it's very clear that this is the high priestly compound, and knowing some things about it help us greatly. One is that the high priestly compound would have both the house of Annas and the house of Caiaphas in it. And the reason that's important is it helps us to understand Peter's denials, because when you try to put the four gospels together on Peter's denials, you can't do it. I've tried, Bullinger has one way of doing it, Werewolf has another way of doing it. I've tried doing it, you can't make 6 clean denials out of the denials of Christ. What you end up with by the time you get through is there are 4 gospels, and all 4 gospels have 3 denials and 3 denials only. And yet those 3 denials don't match. But what you find out is that all 3 of those denials agree in one aspect, that Jesus Christ, that Peter, first of all, went to the gate of the high priest compound, and he was confronted there at the gate, and he denied Christ. And it wasn't a thing where, you're talking about the gate of the high priest compound. It's not like there's one lone girl there. There's a whole bunch of people standing around the gate, and somebody says something, and Peter says no, and somebody else speaks, and Peter says, I'm telling you no, and somebody else speaks, and Peter cusses no. That's not what it is. So there's a denial event at the gate, and then Peter goes to the campfire. And at the campfire in the compound, there's going to be one major campfire area. And at the campfire, Peter's standing there warming himself, and somebody, I think I saw you with that guy Jesus. And Peter denies it, and somebody else says, I think I did too. And so then there's a denial event at the campfire. And it gets literally too hot for Peter. And so he leaves and he goes back to the gate, and there's another denial event. So there are 3 denial events, and at each point there was a group of people that were all in a conversation, and at a different point in that conversation, people began to gang up on Peter, and he began to deny and curse and swear and that kind of thing. So that explains why each of the 4 gospels has 3 denials and 3 denials only, why Peter denied at the gate and in the campfire and at the gate. And it also explains why Jesus, when he met Peter, at the fishing on the Sea of Galilee, said, do you love me? And he said it 3 times. So because Peter had gone through 3 denial events. So that helps a lot to understand that whole mess. Now, I want to share another screen here. One of the archaeological reasons that we believe that this absolutely was the priestly compound, besides where it is located, because it's located at a high point in the town where you get a good view and you get the breeze and all the stuff you want in a really expensive home, location. But also underneath this house, you have a dungeon and you have a place for torture. It's like, okay, who? Really, who has a house with a dungeon and a place for torture and punishment underneath it? Well, the high priest does. The high priest is responsible for the punishment of people who break the Mosaic law. So when you go underneath the house of Caiaphas, then you come down, and I just have one picture here, and of course they have a glass frame in front of it, so you can't go chipping a piece of rock off or something. But you see it's got various cells, and you see how you could tie somebody up by their hands, and how you can strap their legs apart, or wrap their waist in, make sure they don't move side to side. And it's got these various places, and if you go there and you look, there's a number of these cells like this. But the point is that there is at the house of Caiaphas, you have this dungeon underneath it. And so that then becomes really important. So Christ is taken, he rested at the Garden of Gethsemane, taken to the house of Annas in the priestly compound of Annas and Caiaphas. And then he's tried by Annas. And then later he's tried by Caiaphas. So let's look at John chapter, let's see. We've been in John chapter 18. Let's go to Matthew. And in Matthew chapter 26, we're going to see some of the trial of Caiaphas. So, and this brings up another point, by the way, that when we are dealing with the 4 Gospels, it's not the job of each gospel to give all the details. what they do is they give details that are important to the theme that they are espousing. So Matthew, the theme of Matthew is Christ is the king. Mark is Christ the servant. Luke is Christ the human being. John is Christ the Son of God. That's why, for example, 25% of the Gospel of John is about the Last Supper, because it talks about the Son of God then in the fullness of his ministry, teaching and instructing how things are going to be in the future when he is in charge and when he needs everybody else to come along and be one with him. So anyway, the Matthew 28, here's verse 57, the ones who'd seized Jesus led him away to the house of Caiaphas, the high priest, where the experts of the law and the elders were gathered together. So we know from John that he'd gone to Annas first, and then Peter's following. Verse 59, so this is now Christ got questioned at Annas's house, but where the Sanhedrin and the witnesses were gathered was Caiaphas's house. So that's where he goes next. And that's in the same compound. It's basically the equivalent of right next door. That's what happened. Goes to Annas, gets questioned, goes next door to Caiaphas and gets questioned. And so verse 59, now the chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin, and the Sanhedrin is the group of 70 ruling elders over the Jewish world. That's what the Sanhedrin is. It's very similar probably to our Supreme Court, except our Supreme Court has, I think, 7 people instead of 70. And Sanhedrin is related to the word 70. And it says, the chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were seeking false testimony against Jesus so they could put him to death. Now we know that Nicodemus and Joseph Arimathea did not agree with this. So when it says whole Sanhedrin, basically what it's telling you, it's giving you a picture of where the vast majority of the Sanhedrin was. Okay, then I kick back and I take out my notebook and I say, wow, this is a serious mini lesson. You've got 70 guys and a high priest, and the vast majority of them are happy to seek false witnesses. They're happy to try to put an innocent man, Christ, to death. They are happy to do things to promote their own self-interest. This is the way the adversary works in history. Through history, the adversary has worked to get his men and women at the top at every level. And so, I don't for a minute, I'm not naive enough to think that when we have our Senate, that they're just a bunch of really wonderful people who really have my interests at heart. And Christ taught us, you look at the fruit, you look at what they pass. They could pass term limits, they won't do it. They could put themselves under the same health care as we're under, but no, they make their own health care and they put themselves under their own rules. It's like the Senate, what do you call it? Well, I guess you call it a Senate, the State Senate of California. They ban concealed carry except for themselves. They pass concealed carry for themselves. They should be able to carry a gun. Why? Well, gosh, we're senators. We need to protect ourselves. So the average person doesn't need to protect themselves. See, there's a mini lesson here, guys. When I see people at the top, I want to see fruit that they love God. The fact that they're at the top, to me, that more generally indicates that somehow or other they've compromised along the way. We just have to be aware of that. That doesn't mean God doesn't have his men there. I think the fact that Nicodemus is there, that Joseph of Arimathea was there, they're the 2 we know about. There may have been a few others. But as Christian people who are fighting for the truth, and we need to pray properly too, that our fighting and our prayers are headed in the right direction, because there's a war out there, and you want to see where the adversary wants his men. You got the 70 top guys, or 68 or 67 or 66 of them. They're searching for false witnesses. They want to kill Jesus. This is a totally sham trial. By the way, it's sham for a whole bunch of other reasons as well. For one thing, it's at night, and a night trial was illegal. It's also at the high priest's house. That was illegal. It's supposed to be in the temple. I mean, there's so much about this whole trial that's just a sham. that tells you about the nature of the people that were running things. So verse 60, they find two false witnesses, and one said, I'm able to destroy this sanctuary of God and build it in 3 days. And the high priest stood up. Becomes very important. The high priest stood up and said to him, are you not going to answer? What is it that these men testify against you? And up until this point, Jesus had been relatively quiet. One time he spoke and had said, if I've done something wrong, why are you hitting? If I've done something wrong, testify it. Otherwise, why are you hitting me? That's when they were put a bag over his face and punched him in the face. But other than that, he'd remained silent, which is fulfilling the prophecy of Isaiah, that like a lamb before his shearers, he opened not his mouth. But now watch the shift. So now the high priest says, are you not going to answer? And so Jesus is silent, verse 63, and the high priest said to him, I charge you under oath by the living God, that you tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God. Now the high priest has put Jesus in a vice. He said, I charge you under oath by God that you tell us. And so now Jesus is going to speak up. And what he says, verse 64, yes, it is as you say. Moreover, I say to you all. And that's good because Jesus Christ was including everybody. Everybody's going to stand before God at the day of judgment. Moreover, I say to you all, in the future you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. And that was not lost on the high priest, what he said. So just a note I want to bring to our attention here. It's often taught that Jesus Christ was teaching that he was God, and that, John 8:58 and other verses, that Jesus was teaching that he was God, but it's not true. Jesus never taught that he was God. He taught that he was the Son of God, and in the Jewish understanding, God was God, the Shema. Hear, O Israel, Yahweh is our God, Yahweh alone, and the Messiah was Yahweh's representative. That's the way the Jews understood it. So when the high priest said, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God, that's what they understood Christ to be saying. And that's what Christ had been saying, that he was the Son of God. And then when Christ said, yes, you will see me sitting on the right hand of power, this is a little obscure. You've got to understand the customs to get this. But if you look at Psalm 110, verse 1, for example, and if you look at the geography of Jerusalem and the way it works, you have the temple on the top of Mount Moriah. And the temple is looking east over the top of the Mount of Olives. Right down the hill to your right, the first major building is the king's palace. And that wasn't only true in the time of David, Solomon, and the kings. It was also true and will be true in the millennial kingdom. If we read Ezekiel 40-48, it talks about the millennial temple and then being down the hill on the south slope, meaning the right hand is the king's palace. So you have God reigning in his temple, and on his right hand is the king in his palace. And that's exactly what this is talking about. So when Christ says, you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. Coming on the clouds of heaven is a clear reference to Daniel chapter 7, where Jesus Christ comes in the clouds and is given all power and authority by God who's sitting on a throne. You can go back and read Daniel chapter 7. So that's what this is talking about here. What he said was not at all lost on the high priest and those leaders. They knew what he was claiming to be. He's claiming to be the Messiah who's going to come in power, the Messiah who's going to sit in a palace right next to God. He is going to rule the earth. That's absolutely what Christ said. That's absolutely what they understood. And then that's why in 65, Matthew 26:65, the high priest tore his garments, which, by the way, is forbidden in the Levitical law. But I'm trying to think of the verse right away here. It's Leviticus, what is it, 21:10 or 10:21 or something like that? Yeah, 21:10, Leviticus chapter 21, verse 10. It was illegal for the high priest to tear his clothes, but it just goes to show there was so much illegal about this trial anyway. And so he tore his clothes. He said, defaming talk. What further need do we have of witnesses? See, now you have heard the defamation. What do you think? And they answered and said, he's deserving of death. And so then they beat him, and they're going to take him to Pontius Pilate. And by the way, is there anything in the law about it's wrong to say you're the Christ? No, they made that up. They just made up and said, okay, he's worthy of death because he's claiming to be the Christ. No, I don't think so, not at all. So now, so they beat him through the night because they know they've now got to try him, but they can't. Now they got to have a mock trial because they have to be able to go to the people. And when the people say, "Wow, we're crucifying the guy Jesus," he did all kinds of miracles and stuff like that. Was there ever a trial? Then they can't say, "Well, yeah, we met at Caiaphas's house at the night." They've got to have a show. If you read the Jerusalem Post the next morning, it didn't say Christ tried at daybreak, taken to Pilate, eventually crucified. It would have said that. It would have said Christ tried at daybreak, taken to Pilate. Never would have been a word in the newspaper about an illegal night trial. And that's another reason why we've got to look at what people do and not what they say. Because if we really want to know what's going on, you got to watch what people do. And be careful about what they say. So first thing in the morning, they take Christ to the temple to have a daybreak trial. So let's go to Luke chapter 22. And in Luke chapter 22, let's see. There, we're going to go to Luke 22, verse 66. And the daybreak trial is mentioned in a couple different gospels, but Luke has the most extensive report of it. Verse 66, as soon as it was day, the elders of the people, and that's the Jews, gathered together, both the chief priests and the experts in the law, and they led him away into their Sanhedrin chamber, saying, if you are the Christ, tell us. Christ has already told them at Caiaphas's house, so they're pressing the issue. And this now, like I say, they left Caiaphas's house. They're now in the temple, in one of the chambers inside it. And they say, if you're the Christ, tell us. But he said to them, if I tell you, you will absolutely not believe, which was true. And if I ask you, you will absolutely not answer, which was also not true. Verse 69, but from now on, the Son of Man will be sitting at the right hand of the power of God. And they went on in verse 70, and they all said, then are you the Son of God? And he said to them, you say correctly that I am. By the way, I need to say something about that, because the text uses an idiom, just simply, you say that I am. And sometimes it gets taught in Christian circles that Jesus did not answer them, that Jesus just said, well, that's what you say, as if Jesus was somehow being coy or smart. That, he knows he's about to be handed over, he's about to be killed, and he has a chance here. Some of these people, like Joseph, like Nicodemus, there were probably some others that were on the fence about what they thought with Jesus Christ. He's not trying to be cute. He's not trying to be coy. He's not trying to be unclear here. And so he uses an idiom. See, we use idioms all the time that mean things. For example, you meet somebody on the street, you say, how do you do? It doesn't even mean anything. What do you mean, how do I do? How do I do what? But it's an idiom, and it means, are you well? And it's the same thing here when in the idiom, and there's a lot of Greek resources behind this. Although if you read the older resources, they didn't have enough Greek literature to really understand all the idioms. So you've got to read stuff that's more modern. But when Christ said, you say that I am, that was their idiom for saying, you bet. Absolutely, I am. Christ was being very clear. He was being very forthright. And this, again, boy, what a great, here's a little mini lesson. You know, when I meet with other Christians, I don't lead out with what I don't believe. We talk about what we do believe and stuff, but if somebody asks me a straightforward question, do you believe that the dead are dead? Yes, I do. Now, I'll say it in a way that's appropriate and kind and godly, but I'm not going to say, well, we really don't understand about death, and I'm not going to go there, because it's not the way my Lord Jesus Christ led out for me. It's not the example that the Apostle Paul said. And here's a great little mini lesson here. You correctly say that I am. And then again, verse 71, they said, well, what further need do we have witnesses? So then they're going to crucify him. Okay, so now they've got their mock trial at daybreak, in the daytime, in the temple. So now they can write in the Jerusalem Post that they tried Jesus. So now what they've got to do is take him to Pilate. Why? Because they can't kill anybody. Of course, that didn't keep them from killing Stephen, but that was in the heat of the moment. But now they're going to do a public killing, and they don't have the authority to do that because the Romans took that away. So now what they've got to do is they've got to take him to Pilate. And so they do, and that's, let's see, we're in Luke, so we might as well just go to Luke chapter 23, which is the next chapter in Luke. And Luke chapter 23, verse 1, the whole multitude of them got up and brought him before Pilate. And as I said, Pilate now is in the old Hasmonean palace. Remember that Israel was controlled by the Greeks back after Alexander the Great conquered the Greeks, conquered Israel. I'm sorry, Alexander the Great conquered Israel somewhere in the neighborhood of 323 BC, something like that. And then when Alexander the Great conquered Israel became Greek, and it was Greek until what was known as the Maccabean Revolution. And in the Maccabean Revolution, the Maccabees reconquered Israel, and they were a Jewish group, and they had a huge palace in the middle of Jerusalem, and that was the old Maccabean or Hasmonean palace. That became the administrative center, and that becomes very important. So Pilate now meets Jesus at the administrative center. So the whole multitude of them got up. I'm in Luke 23:1. They brought him before Pilate. They began to accuse him. We found this man corrupting our nation and forbidding to give tribute to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ the King. And I like this. They didn't bring up any of these accusations at his trial. Why are they bringing him up now? Because if the reason they said they wanted to put him to death, that he was the Christ, if they said that to Pilate, he'd say, yeah, and? It's like, so what? Does that bother you guys? So he's a lunatic. Big deal. We don't put lunatics to death, So they've got to invent things that make sense to Pilate. And so that's what they're doing here. They're making up things that make sense to Pilate. And so Pilate says, I find no fault in this man, and they stir things up. And at that point, we're in Luke. In verse 5, it says they were more upset. The Jews were the more urgent, saying, he stirs up the people, teaching throughout all Judea, beginning from Galilee and reaching even to this place. Now, Pilate, who really doesn't want to crucify an innocent man at this point, and doesn't want to risk any kind of civil unrest because he knew Jesus was well liked by the people. Where it says, verse 6, when Pilate heard this, he asked if the man were a Galilean. And when he knew that he was of Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him up to Herod, who himself also, was in Jerusalem at that day. Now, at that point, I want to pay attention. I want to go back to the map of Jerusalem. And I'm going to share my screen because this becomes very important. The Greek word translating, the Greek word translating sent up is anapimpto. And it literally means to send up. And you can see this in BDAG, the Greek English lexicon. Let's see, I wrote down 3 meanings. To send from a lower to higher place, which is for, elevation, to send to a person of higher authority, or to send back to a previous location. Well, when Pilate sent Jesus Christ from his administrative center to Herod, he wasn't sending him to a higher authority because Pilate was the Roman governor. He was the highest authority in the land. And he wasn't sending him back because Christ had never been there. But it says he sent Christ up to Herod. And the palace here, the Western Palace, just like here, this area is the high spot in Jerusalem, and much higher than here, which was right on the side of this. You can't really see it well in this picture, but running right through here was a valley called the Tyropoeon Valley. Jerusalem has three valleys. You have the Hinnom Valley, which is where we get Gehenna, the picture of hell. Here you have the Kidron Valley, and here you had the Tyropoeon Valley, which is one of the reasons the wall runs right here. And so this palace is right on the edge of the Tyropoeon Valley, so it's at a very low spot. And so Pilate sent Christ up to Herod. Now, there are many modern versions that don't they're confused about where Christ was, and they don't want to make a big deal, and they just say that Pilate sent Christ to Herod. But the Greek text is very clear, and thankfully the King James picks up on this and does a very literal translation as well, that he was sent up to Herod. Now, interestingly enough, what do we read when we read about that? Because when Pilate ends up, when Christ ends up at Herod's place, let me get back to he sends him up to Herod, and then Herod is really happy to see him, but Christ absolutely says nothing. And that's an interesting indication of, you don't cast your pearls before swine type of thing. There was no chance that Christ was going to convert Herod. And also Herod Antipas had been the one that had cut off the head of Christ's cousin, John the Baptist, because somebody had danced in front of him. When Herodias had danced, or was it Salome? I'm sorry, when Salome had danced in front of Herod, and he said, "I'll give you whatever you want." And she said, "Oh, I want the head of John the Baptist." And Herod just killed John the Baptist, the wonderful, righteous prophet, just simply because of that dance and what he promised. So was Jesus Christ going to talk to Herod? No, he wasn't. And so Herod then sends Christ back to Pilate. And so Pilate now, so that's where you get Pilate again. And this becomes really an important record, because verse 13 says, "And Pilate called the chief priests and rulers and the people together." Now that would have taken a long time. If the morning trial, if there was a daybreak trial in the temple, and it didn't last very long, and then they went to the daybreak trial before Pilate, that didn't last very long. Then they went to the temple, and that didn't last very long. Now they're going to go back to Pirates. They're going to go back to Pilate, trying to keep all this chronological information in my head. So they're going back to Pilate. Well, what's happened to the crowd? What's happened to all the leaders and the elders and all that? Well, they've scattered because they was in front of Pilate. Pilate sent him to Herod. There was no indication that Christ was going to come back from Herod. Nobody's going to hang around at Pilate's place and wait for Christ to come back. Nobody thought Christ was coming back. So everybody goes home. So what has to happen in order for there to be a second trial before Pilate? Then it's going to take a long time to get everybody back together so that you can have that trial. And this then becomes very important, because when if we go to John 18:28, let's see, John 18 and then verse 28. No, that's not the right one. Let's see, is it 18? 45. Let's see. Let's try 19:14. Let's see. I'm looking for the verse that says yes. Here it is, John 19:14. It says, now the preparation of the Passover, it was about the 6th hour. And he, Pilate, says to the Jews, look at your king. Now this is really important when it comes to the chronology of the last week of Jesus Christ, because now it's 12 noon. Well, wait a minute. If Jesus Christ was arrested Thursday night and tried on Friday morning and then led out to be crucified at 9 in the morning, how can he be in front of Pilate at 12 noon? And this is one of the reasons that we know that there were 3 days and 3 nights in the death of Christ. And we can also align the information in the Gospels, because then Christ gets arrested on Monday night. He's taken to Annas, to Caiaphas. Tuesday morning, he's taken to the temple and tried. Tuesday later morning, he's taken to Pilate and tried. Tuesday later morning, he's taken to Herod and tried. By Tuesday at noon, he's before Pilate again. But Pilate's got to get everybody together, and that's going to take some time. And then Pilate sends Christ off to be whipped. When you read the record, and again, I won't take the time to read all of the record, but so Christ is taken off to the Romans to be whipped, and then he's brought back in front of the crowd. And Pilate says, behold your king. And they're not happy with that. And so then they all shout, crucify him, crucify him. And that becomes then very important to understand the chronology of this and put this together. So Herod sends Christ back close to noon. And then what we have is, let's go to Mark chapter 15. And this is why it's nice to have notes on this kind of thing, because if we don't do that, the different things that the Gospels have can make it difficult. So here in the second trial of Jesus Christ before Pilate, that's when you have Barabbas. So in verse 14 of Mark 15, Pilate says to the crowd, what evil has he done? They cried out exceedingly, crucifying. Pilate, wishing to satisfy the multitude, released to them Barabbas, and after having Jesus scourged, he handed him over to be crucified. And then verse 16, so this is afternoon. This is now going to be 2, 3 in the afternoon. Well, they're not going to crucify somebody that late. So verse 16, so the soldiers led him away inside the palace, that is the praetorium, and they called together the whole Roman cohort. This is Passover time. The Romans are scattered all over Jerusalem and all over the local area, keeping the peace. And so, but this is the devil versus the Messiah. He has a chance to kill the Messiah, to torture the Messiah, to see if he can break the Messiah. And so the word goes out, and now Romans from all over gather. That took some time. And so this is happening for what we would call our Tuesday afternoon. The Roman soldiers are gathering, and then they beat Christ through the night. And then in the morning, the last half of verse 20, they led him out to crucify him. And let's see, they crucified him, and somewhere it says it not, oh yeah, verse 25. And it was the 3rd hour, and they crucified him. So now it is Wednesday, 9 o'clock in the morning, and they crucify Christ. And then they did the whole sign thing. And there's a lot that goes on, by the way, between the crucifixion and the death of Christ. And the death of Christ was at 3 in the afternoon, and he was crucified at 9. So he hung on the cross for 6 hours. And during that 6 hours, whole bunch of stuff happened. You know, you had the drinks he refused. You had casting lots for his garments. You had the thieves and the malefactor cursing him. You had the people walking by cursing him. You had a lot of different things going on. You had the one malefactor realize that he was the Christ and asked to, you know, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Christ said, you will be with me in paradise. A lot is going on in that 6 hours. And then not only a lot going on, but then in verse 33, when the 6th hour came, he started at 9 o'clock in the morning. It's now noon, the 6th hour. There was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour, meaning 3 in the afternoon. And then at the 9th hour, Christ calls out, and he quotes Psalm 22. And depending on the gospel you read, there's different things that he says. He says, it is finished. He says to Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they do. He says, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. There's a number of things that he says, and then he breathes his last, and that is the death of Christ. And then at that time, you have a number of things going on very quickly. You have Joseph and Arimathea and Nicodemus, and there's a lot to say about them as well. But I noticed the hour's getting really late. You guys have been really patient. But again, I want to point out that this is the notes on John chapter 18, verse 13. So if you want to go back and review those notes and put together the 10,000-foot picture, then when you read the different things that happened during the record, you can put them together to where they make more sense. And again, I didn't mean to teach quite this long, but I think it's really important that we have kind of an overview understanding of what happened. This is, after all, our Lord Jesus Christ. And God bless you and thank you. And we can chat or take questions or whatever we'd like to do. So God bless you. And again, thank you for hanging in so long.